but
Fireside chat with Jessica Ramos.
yeah, I think this is going to be a good one.
So many people, though.
We've had some really interesting lunchtime speakers, so I think this is going to be a good one going forward to sort of
Should we go out and
tail end of the day, and just remember to
Should we wrap up the
sign
group?
into Slido.
Come back in.
Password policy when you go onto the site to ask questions. Feel free to jump in at any point, posting questions on there. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible as time permits. So just want to introduce myself. My name's John Celock. I'm the Special Projects Editor for City and State New York. Moderating today, wanted to welcome you all here. This is an interesting and very timely and very informative panel on some very interesting, maybe technical, but very interesting, very important subjects, especially to everyone in this room and to everyone in the workforce development space. I know I joined as a founding board member for a nonprofit in New Jersey and a couple years ago, and we were an all-volunteer board for the longest time, and I found myself being plunged into a lot of discussions and dealing with just issues with relation to getting our funding from the state at times, or dealing with some of our member universities, that I was being asked to make decisions on stuff, on issues that I didn't even know existed. So it's, I at least can sympathize with a lot of people in knowing what a lot of these issues are and what you're working with. So without further ado, I'm gonna ask the first question for our panel, which is if you could briefly introduce yourselves and just sort of give the 35,000 foot perspective of where you're coming from on today's topic. Why don't we start with Ira, then we'll work our way down the table.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ira Yankwit. I'm the Executive Director of the Literacy Assistance Center here in New York City. We are not a direct service provider. We are a professional development, technical assistance, and advocacy organization that works to strengthen and expand the adult literacy education system here in New York City. I'm, just by a show of hands, how many of you or represent organizations that receive city contracts through an RFP process? Great. So in a little while, I'm going to talk from my experience as an organization that is overwhelmingly funded by the city and the state, speak about some of the issues that we've had, and I'm going to be genuinely interested in whether or not what I say does or doesn't resonate with your experience. So I look forward to getting some feedback from all of you in a little bit.
Councilman Justin Brannan. I'm chair of the Finance Committee in the City Council, and my first term I spent 2 years as chair of the Contracts Committee. Also spent some time working at nonprofits before I got into politics. For a show of hands, how many folks that raised their hand before are currently owed money by the City of New York?
Well, and how many are not owed money? Leave your hand up.
Yeah. So I think that's part of why we're here today, and part of what me and my colleague, Councilmember Juan, are trying to fix. So it's good to be here today, and I come to the council as an outsider, someone who never really thought I'd ever end up in politics, but I love helping people. I love undoing knots. I love, trying to untangle the most complicated knots, because I think ultimately it's what our city needs, and it's what your organizations need.
I'm John MacIntosh. I run a nonprofit called SeaChange, Capital Partners, and our mission is to help other not-for-profits in the city navigate whatever sort of complicated financial challenge they're facing. And so we've seen firsthand over a decade how many nonprofits call us because they want to borrow money because we're a lender, or they need help shutting down in the worst case, which we've seen some of. And while it's not always the case, in many, many cases, one contributing factor, often the biggest contributing factor, is late payment by the city. I think it's not only the number one cause of nonprofit distress, it's certainly the number one cause of anxiety and sleepless nights on behalf of nonprofit leaders. And so we've been trying to keep the issue in the public eye by periodically analyzing and writing about late payment, So much so that in some circles, I'm called the procurement guy, which is not something I would have expected, but there you go.
Good afternoon. It's so good to see you all. My name is Julie Won. I'm currently the chair of contracts for the New York City Council. I'm a council member from Western Queens. I represent Long Island City, Sunnyside, Woodside, and Astoria. Prior to joining the council, I spent about 10 years as a federal contractor for the federal government, as a consultant for a large tech company, but I also served on the boards of local nonprofits where I would help them respond to RFPs so that they could continue to grow their budget and grow their capacity. What I've seen firsthand on the other side, on the recipient side, where we would have years go by without payment from the government, where our executive directors would forego their payments or sometimes their bonuses, or we would have to have furloughs of very extremely necessary services for our most vulnerable communities go without pay so that they can continue to serve because they're doing the work they love, but it just was not fair. And in a city budget like ours, if about 20% of our city's budget annually is spent on city contracts, that's at least billions of dollars, $20 to $30 billion that we could be spending in our city's contracts, but they are not being paid on time. I have been doing a lot of dances with Councilmember Brannan or Chair Brannan of the Finance Chair, as well as Michelle Jackson and all of our coalition partners, to try to get the city to pay. But we get a lot of funny celebrations where they say, well, you know, the council is now allowing multi-year contracts. Yes, we should have done that a long time ago, and we're allowing that for discretionary funds of a few $1,000s from each council member offices. But what we really need to start to hone in on and continue to press on are the millions and millions of dollars contracted to cities through city agencies like DFTA, MOCJ, DYCD, DCLA, you name it, we have to go after them because they are continuing to be delinquent on their payments to our nonprofit partners. And here comes Michelle.
I like that half warning, half intro. So hi everyone, I'm Michelle Jackson. I'm the executive director of the Human Services Council. We represent about 180 human service nonprofits in New York City and New York State, and we do policy and advocacy on behalf of the sector, really focusing on those who contract with government. You know, it's not really a nice thing. We've been dealing with the contracting issue for a long time. That's not a great thing to say because we should maybe not have this panel anymore if we were doing really great at our jobs. So, but one of the core issues that HSC has picked up on has been late contracting. You know, there's $6 billion worth of contracts with New York City nonprofits to provide essential life-saving services, and we are paid last and least on purpose. It's not an accident that the system works the way that it does. We've seen some successes with each administration and then failures with each administration in getting people paid. And it's certainly the worst it's ever been. So my kind of 35,000 foot view is like everything's terrible, and here we are, panel over. We think, you know, so it is really the worst
And
it's
in
ever
January,
been.
it's gonna get worse.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And we're not looking at something that's going to change on, you know, a state or federal level anytime soon. And so, you know, these can feel like intractable problems, but I will say we have seen it get solved and reversed over the years. And so there's always a solution. I think we have real partners in this council more than ever before who understand the nonprofit sector, have introduced really important legislation. We'll talk about all of that, but I don't like to just leave it with, it's terrible. Thanks for coming. So there are some real solutions that we'll talk about today.
Okay, so John, why don't we start with you? And I'm going to please, at least for portions of this, urge you and everyone else to sort of try to keep the answers to not, well, starting under Mayor LaGuardia. But, okay, so we've got this late payments. What is causing this problem? Why haven't any of the previous solutions actually worked? And how did we get here?
So first of all, let's just make sure we understand what the problem is. There's two problems. There's contracts being registered late. And as your lawyers will tell you, the city, not only does it not legally have to pay you until the contract's registered, it legally can't pay you. So like the registration date is the first date you could ever possibly get paid. There's late registration, and then there's late payments for contracts that are registered. And lest anybody gaslight you with something that says, our commitment to the returnable grant fund shows that the city is committed to paying its nonprofit partners. As of this morning, I pulled the data from last night, 88% of the 2024 contracts were registered late. That was 100% of the discretionary contracts and 2/3 of the others. 50% of the discretionary contracts still haven't been registered. As of last night, 2,000 contracts remain unregistered, and the out-of-pocket costs associated with those contracts is about $600 million. And the interest cost, which is theoretical, because most of you can't borrow the money, is about $30 million. That's late registration. So just have $600 million in your mind. Late payments against registered contracts for boring analytical reasons that I can go into if you're interested. It's a little bit harder to prove what's going on. But my guess, again, as of data from last night in Checkbook NYC, is about $1 billion of late payments. So call it $1.6 billion. Now, if you owed Elon the money, he could float it. But for nonprofits, $1.6 billion is real money. So it's a real problem.
Yeah, with 7% interest for the loan that they've taken out.
If you could even borrow the money, which you can't. I won't go back. I will only go back to Donald Maness. The feds pay on time. And if you talk to the grizzled veterans of this city, they will say it all goes back to Donald Maness, that any procurement system has conflicting objectives: preventing corruption, or at least the appearance of corruption, efficiency and fairness. And with that scandal, we put in place a labyrinth system that we've mostly added to, not subtracted from, which we live with today. I'm going to just say two other things. Someone did a scholar did an analysis of the Maness history. This was 10 years after the fact. In the wake of the scandals, there was no balance. It was a mad rush to cover everybody's butt. We heard one common refrain: it's far more important to look honest and diligent than get anything done. So I think the reason that we've struggled, even though very good people have tried very hard, at least in the 3 administrations that I've known, to do anything better than occasional whack-a-mole followed by backsliding, is that we have processes that are labyrinth, and I would argue it's not really clear actually prevent corruption, number one. Number two, Marla Simpson, who, if you know Marla, hard-boiled head of MOX under Bloomberg, she did a back-of-the-envelope calculation that there's probably 3,000 people involved with procurement in the city. So, if you have really complicated processes that 3,000 people have to work with, you can't expect 3,000 perfect people. You can't expect 3,000 people who wake up every morning committed to being the best procurement professionals that they have. You need to have processes that 3,000 real people can work with, and we don't. And then the final thing I would say is power. The city, the journal, the newspaper, The City, digital newspaper, you probably read it. If you don't, you should. They did an investigative piece on procurement that was published last week or 2 weeks ago, and almost no nonprofits were willing to go on the record. Every once in a while, there'll be a beautiful exception in something like legal services, where it's a constitutionally mandated service with a finite number of providers, so they can all, it's like the wildebeest running across the river, you can't kill us all, where they'll write a joint letter. But other than that, no nonprofit will speak up. No nonprofit will make a fuss, because they don't want to get canceled. Whether they really will or not, who knows? That's their fear. And I think some of them have Stockholm Syndrome, because they see, Stockholm Syndrome, hostages. A hostage comes to feel fellow feeling with their hostage taker. That they see that the people in the city really are trying their best, but the results are still terrible because the processes are bad. And so what I hope we have in the next administration, whether it's Adams 2 or not, is really revisiting some of these principles from the start. What do we really need here? What are we really doing? There was a McKinsey team engaged to study that process in July and August of 2022. I know that because they interviewed me. As far as I know, that report either doesn't exist or it's been buried at the bottom of the East River. I have tried to discover what they discovered. I have not been able to, and all the people who hired them are no longer with the administration. That's a separate topic. But I really think that the only way to make progress is to go back to the policy review board at some of the underlying guidelines and legislations and try to fix it at that level, because no amount of hard work seems to be working. Was that depressing? Maybe.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Anyone else want to jump in on just how we got here?
I mean, John bummed out the room. I mean, I think I would just add, yes, ditto. And I think we've just seen, I would add to the procurement is not a sexy topic. Nobody runs for office on, well, they more should, because we all vote
Except
for them.
for Justin.
Exactly. I was going to say, I was like, there's a couple of exceptions. They're here in the room with us. And it's also what can feel like an intractable problem, because it is like whack-a-mole. And so HSC has done a lot of work to get the sector to respond to interview requests and testifying at City Council. And I think the sector is more willing than they've ever been before to take those risks. But there also has to be, I think there has to be an administration who's really committed to this change. I think that's true with Lisa Flores, but with hiring freezes and other things, I think that brings hiring freezes, lack of staff. There's always been a lack of focus on this issue, so that has spanned administrations. But I do think that what we see now is a nonprofit sector who is willing to be much more aggressive and respond. HSC also runs the Just Pay campaign. We slept outside City Hall. Those 50 people will absolutely go on the record now, but there has to be, something on the other side of it. And when it comes down to hiring freezes and we're fighting with pegs and all of those issues, it can feel like there isn't, one path forward. And so there has to be kind of a confluence of this administration has to commit to, whatever administration has to commit to doing this now, and there has to be a real focus on it. And it's a combination of just caring, and at the end of the day, there's these systems like HHS Accelerator, which became Passport, has its own set of problems, but it doesn't matter how great the system is, there's still humans behind it who push the buttons. And so the solution is really to have an administration who's committed to paying nonprofits on time. And that's honestly, it sounds like an oversimplification, but that's all it takes. There are staff at those agencies, they could push those buttons, they could approve invoices, and there is some sort of choice not to do that on a daily basis.
And Michelle, in the last 3 weeks, this is my second procurement policy panel, so maybe some people really do get into it.
Yes, we're changing people one mind at a time.
I think it's making sure that outside of this room, right, many of you may be a vendor for the city and you are waiting for your payments and it's extremely frustrating. But it's translating and communicating to the rest of the world of those who benefit from the services that you provide on behalf of the city, that they are starting to realize. For example, I think one of the smartest campaigns I saw outside of the cost of living adjustment campaign, where you guys flooded City Hall, the entire block. That was the highest turnout that we've ever seen, even though the administration didn't blink an eye. But we blinked our eyes and we're like, whoa, we've never seen such massive amounts of bodies outside of City Hall, and we still haven't. That's still the largest one I've seen in my tenure. But New York Edge after school program, they had every single parent write a handwritten postcard to their elected official saying that my after school programming was cut. And that's extremely effective. It also came with little doodles from their children. And that kind of organizing really works, because then you see the volume of the people who care because now their direct lives are impacted. And the problems that we're prescribing aren't new, right? There's multiple layers. We have a very archaic government and a system itself, aside from the process, that is extremely difficult to untangle or untie because we have multiple agencies. We also have quasi-city agencies that we don't have full jurisdiction over, like H&H and DOE. But also within the city agencies themselves, we don't even have a centralized database to be able to compete in a 2024 century to say that we have systems that talk to each other across city agencies. And Passport is attempting to do that now, but even for Passport, so processes aside, the system in which we are running our registrations and invoicing, RFP responses on, that in itself doesn't even have quality assurance being tested by a third party. So if you don't come from the tech industry like myself, so what does that mean? If I produce a product for you and you tell me, Julie, test your product to say that yours is up to date and that it's running smoothly, am I gonna tell you the truth as a vendor that my system sucks? No, I'm gonna tell you it's great and dandy and beautiful. But we're going to fix that because now we're legislating to mandate that quality assurance testing is done by a third party. There are simple steps that we can take. And for example, for compliance, We just heard from John about all this corruption that we were trying to fight. Clearly, we're not fighting much corruption, are we, this year? There has been a lot of corrupt contracts that have gone signed by the comptroller and the mayor. So whatever we were trying to fight, this is not it. There are plenty of loopholes, and people are still getting by. And what I learned is that our compliance systems in the contracting, it takes more than 38 hours, and sometimes even beyond 72 hours for me to pull up a Microsoft DOS on where the contract is currently and what compliances it has met. That's a huge problem in the year 2024. We need to do better just from a systems perspective. And like Michelle said, if we have continued to cut the MOC's budget for the PS and OTPS and they don't have personnel to actually do the work, then how are we going to process any payments? I know you all love ChatGPT and all, but that's not even part of the government. We have no automations here. So there's a complex layers of work that we have to get through, but I believe with the people that we're sitting here with, that we will be able to push the administration in the right direction.
I think the only automation I've seen is the Thruway Authority. You can find out how to get a rest stop.
I think the only automations that I've seen are mostly chatbots for city agencies where you want to talk to a person because you genuinely need services, but then they make you talk to a bot to never get any customer service.
Okay. So, Justin, want to sort of segue into some legislation that you've introduced to address the late payments, adding interest to them, and other things. Can you sort of discuss the legislation, where it's at, what are its chances for passage?
Sure. My colleague, Councilmember Wan, made a lot of good points. I mean, I think you see, we're writing blank checks to companies like DocGo or Garner or whoever, but meanwhile, you guys are not getting paid. I mean, so clearly some vendors are getting paid rather quickly and with very little oversight, while you guys are still owed money from services rendered 2, 3, 4 years ago. I met with someone last night who told me his organization is owed about $10-15 million. It's completely insane. So the bill I have now is Intro 982, and what it seeks to do is put the city on the hook for the interest of the loans you have to take while you're waiting to get paid. Now, I don't want to pass this bill, right? My plan is to pass it, and I've never gotten a quicker phone call from the Office of Management and Budget when they saw the bill being aged. So we got their attention, and finally. So I'm giving them a little bit of time to sit down with us to try to figure out a way that we can actually fix this, and I think we all know how it can be fixed. Passing a bill like this would be very, very expensive, but it's also very expensive to do nothing, right? There's a price for doing nothing that you guys are all paying, and I think that the city is behaving like a deadbeat parent right now, and it's wrong, and it's wrong because you guys have done the work. They rely on you guys, and you become so entwined with your communities that people don't even know that you're not city agencies, and that speaks to how crucial and critical the work is that you do. And the city treats you like partners in that they clearly contract with you because they can't do all this on their own, but then when it's time to pay you, they treat you like a stranger. And it's wrong. And I'm glad that with the help of people like Michelle, that this topic has been aerated and sort of bubbled up to a level that now more and more people know about it in a closer to a mainstream way. But the calcified dysfunction that we're dealing with this is just the way it's done because this is the way it's always been done, is completely broken and busted. So my bill would, again, I don't want to pass the bill. I think it would help, obviously. It would be very, very expensive and costly, but I'm trying to get OMB to actually pay attention now and to actually fix this thing once and for all. Give them a little bit of time. If they can't fix it, then we're going to pass the bill. And they're going to have to pay, they're going to have to cover your interest for the loans that you take out to get your money. And it's insane that it's gotten to this place. But here we are, and I think no one is going to win an election talking about procurement reform, but it's pretty damn important. And I think to Councilmember Wan's point earlier, it's important that we build for us to go into these rooms and fight to make these changes, it's important that you have our back, but it's also important that we have each other's back, but it's also important to humanize and put a face on what this is about. This is, inevitably, there's always a story in the tabloids about what certain CEOs of nonprofits get paid, and they love to go back to that. But they don't talk about the human aspect and the fact that a lot of your organizations are, quite literally there in people's darkest hour. And the city is hanging you out to dry. So I'm happy that something that's so depressing and needs to be fixed so badly has finally become a little bit more known to those who aren't in the sector. But you guys are obviously most, feeling it in the most acute way. And I'm ready to pass the bill. But I'm giving them a little bit of time because they could easily fix this. And I do know that Director Jiha from OMB, he hears it from people too. But we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, it's broken and, it's always been like this. I mean, I think a lot of these agencies are super skeletal also, and that's a big problem because there are human beings who have to push those buttons. And when these agencies are very top-heavy, but the folks that actually do the work in the middle and the lower levels, you have just massive, vacancies in these agencies, it's a problem, right? The fact that you can build something in the city quicker than you can get HPD paperwork processed, I'm barely exaggerating, right? And it's a real problem, and it can only be fixed by taking this seriously and making sure these agencies have the resources they need to get this done.
Okay, Michelle, the issues with this, with late payments, is this something that is an issue that can be solved with more staff dedicated to this? Or is this an issue that technology can fix? Or some kind of combination thereof?
Both and neither. So I won't go back, into the eons, but, Bloomberg created HHS Accelerator and had a really dedicated team. I think the magic in the Bloomberg administration was he had a deputy mayor for Health and Human Services, a MOX director, Marla Simpson, and a staff that worked together. And so when the MOX team said the agencies aren't listening, Linda Gibbs, as deputy mayor, was like, those are my agencies, they're under my authority. So there was kind of this magic in kind of their unity of like forcing the agencies to the table and, making sure that contract deliverables was a priority of the administration. So that's not more staff, that's just smart staff who work together. And kind of when you have siloed agencies, that's a problem that you run into. De Blasio, there was plenty of people who worked at City Hall. There was like 2 program directors for every program. And it got worse. It got much worse. So it's not always more staff. The de Blasio administration left one of the biggest backlogs we'd seen, and I have to give the Adams administration credit. They did clear $6 billion in 3 months during their first year in office, and that's a whole year's worth of contracts. That's not something they should have had to do. That means like what was left on those desks when there was a lot of staff was. So staff doesn't always fix it, I think is what I would say. And at the same time, this current administration, administration needs more staff to do this work. And they also need a clear directive that MOX, Lisa Flores is the right person to lead MOX. I will say this in every space I'm in. She knows this city and the procurement system inside and out. And people should just do what she says, I think is actually the short answer. And if Lisa says do it, everybody at City Hall should just do it. And I should do it, everyone here should do it. And so I think it is a combination of staff and technology. I think Accelerator was better than Passport. Passport is not as bad as it has been made out to be, and it's been kind of made the scapegoat of some of these delays when it's really the people behind or the lack of people behind the system. So I think we definitely need more staff in this current administration to do this job. We need better, Passport needs to be fixed, and there needs to be a dedicated team to make sure that Passport works the way it's supposed to work. But I think more importantly, it's about political will, which is like the thing that no one really likes to, especially in the nonprofit space. But the reality is that what we actually need is this kind of conversation. We need these council members here who are doing the exact job that we need them to do, who are elevating this issue and also understand it in a way that previous councils have not understood it. It's not just about discretionary. It's not just about small nonprofits. It's not just about the big agencies either. It's about legislation, but I think more importantly, it's about scaring the budget director, which I have to thank Councilmember Brannan for. and we sent over a list of 30 organizations to the budget director that were owed $250 million within 24 hours of him being scared, and, to just show how big the problem was. And then on the nonprofit side, there does have to be more political will to say no. We have organizations who will now not start doing work on a contract until it is registered, which is a tough thing. And I think when we see things like the lack of response during COVID, or the fact that DocGo could get $500 million, and the directive to pay their staff more than nonprofits are allowed to pay their staff, I think there's a realization in the sector that maybe the city isn't necessarily their partner, and so there has to be a change in how nonprofits respond to the city, and that's part of HSC's part of the work. We don't expect that to come from City Hall. That's our job, but it's a combination of those things. So not one of those things will fix it. It has to all come together.
Anyone else want to jump in on this one? Okay. Julie,
Yes.
you've been working a lot to increase transparency in the procurement process. Would you be able to, and the payment process, could you talk a little bit about the work you're doing on this issue and where it stands and where it's going?
Yeah, like we mentioned, it's like going back in time. I feel like we're back in the mafia mob days where if you're a friend, you get millions of dollars. If you're a friend, you get millions of dollars. And that is not okay. So most recently, we passed 2 pieces of legislation that I think are really important. Local Law 105 and Local Law 107. And what each of them does is, one, firstly, we start to get whistleblowers calling me directly and my office, letting us know that they have been a long-time vendor with the city as a nonprofit. And some of them were running shelters all throughout the city with DHS. And they were specifically told by certain leadership in the administration that you best subcontract with this specific food vendor. And when they did not, they lost their primary contract when it came up for renewal. So seeing those kind of arbitrary terminations, we legislated to make sure that there is a way for us to require the agency to provide an explanation of a denial of approval for a subcontractor in writing, because currently you could just deny them and not hear anything back. Secondly, we also legislated to make sure that the Procurement Policy Board to promulgate rules relating to protest to procurement actions, that you are able to do so as a subcontractor or as a contractor. We need to make sure that we're continuing to move forward. Lastly, we're going to be introducing a 3-part bill that is going to require the city to implement and maintain a comprehensive digital procurement and contract management system, like we were talking about earlier, on one of the ways that we need to upgrade our systems technologically, and also allow the city's chief procurement officer to procure separate quality assurance contract, like we were saying, so that you're not testing yourself as a vendor for the city's systems, to say that it's functional. And also they will be responsible for implementing and maintaining the system and conducting reviews every 6 months to make sure that these compliance tools are up to date. We're going to have to make sure that this is not an unfunded mandate, but that we actually have investments from the city to keep these systems up to date. And I think furthermore, we're also able to pass a document vault as well to codify it, because it has come during the budget negotiations, come to our insight that OMB did not value these systems that have been put in place. Whether it's HHS Accelerator or whatever you want to call it, Passport, I'm not married to a certain vendor providing a tool. But we cannot let go or divest in the tool that is 60% built so that we are modernizing the way that we do procurement. So for us, I think the more that we are able to centralize and make it public, so that we have a Passport public, the way that we currently have Checkbook, so that way anyone in the public can see what the status of a contract is, and have in writing why somebody was denied, and potentially have in writing why someone was rewarded. It should not be because this is the friend of my deputy mayor who's married to this person who grew up with this friend and we went to high school together. No, that is not how it should work. And we have to continue to look at legislation as well as processes to make sure that it's transparent, so that we can continue to make sure there is no rampant corruption in our government when it comes to millions and millions of dollars.
Anyone else want to jump in on this, or?
I want to hear from Ira.
Well, this is very good timing because what I want to do is pick up on your comments about transparency and actually expand them to talk about agency accountability, and specifically agency about accountability to the communities themselves. I just want to start by saying I'm feeling really seen and understood by this panel as
like
a
therapy.
small nonprofit vendor.
Therapeutic.
So I really want to thank you. You've just saved me an hour of therapy, so appreciation. So the name of the panel, Contracting for Change Solutions for New York City's Procurement Challenges. And I want to actually focus on the other end of the challenges, not so much on the payment side once you have a contract, but on the RFP and contracting side itself. And that's where I want to talk about transparency and agency accountability to stakeholders and communities. And this is where I'm really going to genuinely ask you if my experience is similar to your experience. My experience with RFPs and contracting is that it operates a little bit like a secretive star chamber. The RFP comes out, and yes, there's a concept paper, and there is some pro forma process through which we're able to give input, but typically we don't see a lot of change from concept paper to RFP. The reason I say it's a secretive star chamber, I certainly never know who is actually writing the RFPs in the agency. Who is setting the evaluation criteria for the RFPs? Who is reviewing the proposals? Who is making the decisions? And when I say who, I don't mean I mean names. I would like to know who exactly is leading this process, which is making decisions that have dramatic impact on our communities. I will tell you who is not involved in that process, right? It is not the program participants themselves. It is not grassroots community organizations. It is not community boards. It is not council members, right? And my solution to the challenge is very simple, that the stakeholders, the community representatives, the community voices need to be involved in every stage of the procurement and contracting process. And when that doesn't happen, right, the agencies often, even when they're well-meaning, they are creating challenges and problems for themselves, shooting themselves in the foot, but also potentially severely harming our communities. And I want to use a case study. Is there anyone from DYCD in the room?
There was.
Yeah, probably, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but in terms of that fear of speaking up, at least I'm not going to be facing that for the next few minutes. So let me go back to the spring of 2022. I'm going to tell a story, and actually two of the heroes for this story are actually sitting on the panel, Councilmember Wan and Councilmember Brannan. Back in the spring of 2022, Councilmember Wan secured an additional $6 million for community-based adult literacy services in New York City, bringing the total amount of funding for contracted CBOs through DYCD to $17 million. It increased services for thousands of students. She secured that funding in 2022 for FY23, secured it again with, of course, the support of Councilmember Brannan in 2023 for FY24. Back this winter, in anticipation of FY25, DYCD put out a long-awaited RFP for adult literacy services. Inexplicably, they cut the funding from the $17 million that had been secured for those programs for the previous 2 years, cut it down to just $12 million. So immediately, we were going to lose services.
During a migrant crisis, where we
Yes.
had an influx of people who needed adult literacy classes.
Thank you for that. And even more inexplicably, and to Councilmember Wan's point, they set up criteria to distribute these funds that would have left 70% of longtime providers ineligible to secure contracts, would have displaced thousands of students already in classes from the programs that they were in, again, at the height of the migrant crisis, and left certain neighborhoods and even whole council districts, including Councilmember Wan's, without an adult literacy program, meaning no adult basic education, no GED, no ESOL. It did not have to be this way, right? If there had been input from the council members themselves, from the communities themselves, from the community organizations, from the students in these programs, this would have been a better RFP. Insult to injury, right? As a result of the cut, the council, through the leadership of Council Member One, Council Member Brannan, and a number of other council members, in this year's budget, included an additional $10 million for adult literacy services through discretionary funding. So if you're following the math here, got $6 million, cut 5, $10 million more. This, by the way, and I know we're not supposed to go back to LaGuardia, I'm going to go back to Koch, right? This was the largest single investment in adult literacy services going back to the Koch administration. So, you know, I'm really honored to be on the panel and be able to thank you both personally and on behalf of our programs, our organizations, our field, and most especially our students for making this investment. Here's the problem. To this day, that money has not been contracted out, right? Programs are waiting. Why? Because the council still needs to negotiate with DYCD around the terms and conditions, right? So the very agency that didn't include input from the council, from the community, from the students, from the programs to begin with, creating the problem, now is continuing the problem by not allowing this funding to move forward under the terms and conditions set by the council. So again, you know, my message here, the challenge is that there is not community and stakeholder involvement in the procurement process. The solution is to involve them. They are the experts. I would hope, and you all can tell me if I'm wrong, if there is an RFP to build a building, right? Part of the review process includes getting experts who really know whether or not that building is going to stand or fall down, right? It would be unconscionable to think about making a decision without engaging the experts. Who are the experts on the social and human service contracts? They are the participants, they are the community members, they're the council members. They should be more involved in the process. That's my solution.
And I'm just going to ask the follow-up question is, because I know I was just in a meeting for that nonprofit board that I'm on, and we were discussing an idea that we were having for something to do long-term. And my first thought is, before we move forward on like anything on this, even like asking for grants or whatever, grant applications, maybe we should do simple stakeholder engagement to figure out what the issues are before we move forward. Why are we not seeing stakeholder engagement coming out of city government? And anyone want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, so, the reason is that first, there's kind of a myth around the RFP process that if you are someone who's going to compete for one, that you can't be engaged in the process. That's a myth, and actually, the de Blasio administration released a whole guide around how that's a myth, and there's different ways to get collaborative input. The city has stopped doing concept papers on a lot of cases, so there's not even concept papers. And so I think first, there's kind of the myth of, if you're someone who might apply, you can't get stakeholder, can't give your input because then you'd be someone who'd be ineligible to apply. That's a myth. That's not true. And honestly, I think it comes down to like timing and government efficiency. We've seen the last 10 to 20 RFPs that have come out are coming out a year or 2 years late. There's a Compass Sonic RFP from like, I don't know at this point, 2016, 2017 that was pulled in that, in one of those years and still hasn't been, released afterwards. And that's a bunch of after school type programs. And so I think it's really about government inefficiency and the fact that they're kind of running through this process. They have 5 to 7 years to release a new RFP, and it seems like a year after it's supposed to have been released, they're like, oh, yeah, let's get that out there. They do their research. I'm sure, to your point about like the Star Chamber, I'm sure there's smart people somewhere. You have to like hope, right, that there's smart people somewhere. But there is a real lack of engagement in the process, and I think that also results in a remarkably uncompetitive process. And I think that's like where, I think the frustration of late payments and contract registration also starts from the fact that nonprofits are left out of this process, and it's so remarkably rushed. We see procurements that are out for 30 or maybe 45 days for people to compete. What new organization is competing? And I represent the larger organizations who do have a development team who can brush off the old RFP and like submit it. They don't want to do that either, right? Like they don't want to not be looking at what other countries or other localities are doing. They want to change their programs. And so we end up all being part of this like really inefficient process that's also uncompetitive and isn't having new vendors involved. And it really just stems from simple government inefficiency and a lack of kind of following a calendar and putting a lot of care and thought into the process. There's no legal issues here. There's no procurement issues here. It really is about just a lack of care for the community.
Yeah, and I think the government likes to hide behind these task forces. I don't know how many of you have been in these task forces. I don't know what task work that they're doing. I don't know, they're not clearing my task work. But we know that the comptroller, the mayor's office of contracts, and someone from city council, but it wasn't me or Justin. I don't know who was on it. Couldn't tell you who it was. It wasn't a council member for sure. But they had a working group task force to reform the contracting services, and the only output that we had was putting in multi-year contracts for discretionary awards from the city council, which is good, but not nearly enough. It's not even scratching the surface. So, and also there's this opaqueness to how you get into this task force. Like, we've written letters being like, there's not a single black person on this task force. Can we put a black representative on here? And they were like, oh no, but we'll let you meet with someone to brief you on these meetings after they take place. So we don't know how they were formed, but I'm kind of over these task forces and working groups that where you get to say it's like a therapy session where you get to say how you feel, and then they're like, okay, write it down on a Post-it, and then they take photos of it, and then nothing ever gets reflected in the RFP. I don't know, someone's got a contract with Post-its. But we need to make sure that we're actually living in our current century, which is 2025 almost, where crowdsourcing can be done very easily across the city through a surveying app, whatever it is that we want to collect feedback from. We can do it quickly and we could do it easily, but we're just choosing not to do it, but we should do it.
Yeah, I know I shouldn't say this as a reporter who's spent his entire career covering politics and government, but I just want to clarify that this is not an episode of The Office or Parks and Rec,
No, it's
and this is real life.
Or is it?
Yeah, if I can just interject, I guess I would say that there are three separate issues as I see them. There's how are contracts awarded, and there's always going to be some element of nonprofit Hunger Games, because when Michelle talks about competition, you're competing with other not-for-profits, and so, you know, I don't imagine. I think we can do a lot better at how contracts are awarded, but you're never going to make everybody happy because everybody.
Unless you're friends with someone who.
Right. Yes. Then there's do the contracts pay enough, and we know they don't.
Right.
And then there's paying on time, and to me, the third one is the easiest of those three. Right? Like the other ones are above my pay grade, or they're certainly harder. How do we award contracts? How much will be paid under contracts are harder questions than paying the bills on time. And my plea, which I wrote to the mayor in a letter I'm sure he didn't read, was the time to pay what's owed, to do another round of whack-a-mole has to be now. Because any nonprofit that's got its head screwed on is battening down the hatches for the new federal administration. Like, who knows what's going to happen, but it's not going to be good. And so this is a time when every ducat that you're owed, you really need to take in and put under the bed. And so, like, if not now for another round of whack-a-mole, when? Like, it has to be now. And the second thing I'll say, to politicize this discussion, although this is a safe space, is, you know, there is some nonsense out there about in the election, like blue cities need to prove they can fucking get shit done. And paying your bills is pretty, in most people's mind, pretty low down the hierarchy of difficulty, right? If you just can't pay your bills on time, that you're not sending a great example to your citizens or the people in the state or the people in the country about what the city can do. So I will say again, Mayor Adams, please, before the end of January, for all of our sakes, pay the bills.
Well, I just want to talk about an elephant in the room. When Mayor Adams was saying, or the administration was saying that currently we are in a crisis, our tax revenues are not high enough, we are going to not have enough money in our reserves, there's not enough money, every single agency has to take a 5% cut, and we have to bring our spending down. And when that mandate was made publicly, what did the agencies do? And this happens on every level of government. The first things to go are contractors. And that's intentional. And even with our payments, I dare say that our friend Jacques Jihad looks at his books every single year where he says, we don't want to spend this much money. Why don't we withhold this payment for this fiscal year and then pay them next fiscal year so that we are spending less this year? And that's a real part of this conversation, where they're making intentional decisions to keep their spending down for certain agencies to make themselves look like these blue states are not overspending money. We are fiscally frugal and we are doing the right thing. So there's that.
So I want to jump in, and this question was the first one asked from the audience, and it's almost like they're reading Ira's mind. And I think I actually may know the answer to this one, but I'll ask it anyway. I'll ask it. Why can't the city release RFPs earlier? The state education department did that, so contracts were registered well before services were to be provided.
Discretionary items are different.
Anyone want to jump in on this?
There's no good reason.
There's no good reason.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Discretionary items are
I mean, it's also just disorganization. You know, when I first got into this job, I thought, this person is trying to screw me. And then everyone around me, they're like, no, they're not. It's just incompetence. And then I'm like, oh. And over time, it's clear. It's not intentional that they're trying to release it 30 days before. Like, usually they're scrambling themselves to figure out what they're doing. And then they have to get a certain number of levels of approvals. And the next thing you know, now instead of 60 days, we have 30 days to respond to this. So that's what I think.
Yeah.
Also-
Yeah, that's my answer.
It also seems to me from our experience with DYCD that they're understaffed. And that they, for reasons I don't quite understand, move staff around between positions such that it creates a learning curve for someone who actually had expertise in another area. And I'm sure there's a good reason for that, but on the receiving end, it just feels like you're dealing with somebody who you have to get up to speed, which can be very frustrating. So it just seems like they're understaffed, don't have the right people in the right places, and that slows down the process. I also know that, sort of thinking back to my Star Chamber analogy, one of the people who was very involved in the creation of the concept paper for the adult literacy RFP, who actually facilitated the concept paper listening sessions, if you will, by the time the RFP was released, had sent out a very cheery note saying that they were leaving DYCD to go on to another job, right? So when you have junior people leading processes, I completely understand someone wanting to go on for a different job or a better job, but if they're leaving in the middle of the process or at a crucial moment in the process, that's going to slow down and hold up the process. So it just seems like there are just internal issues, and if you have an administration that kind of wants to starve the beast, if you will, and take money out of the agencies, right, it creates then the very inefficiencies which then justify their argument that it's inefficient, right? So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and I think on the flip side, because I think it's always important, like government, there are examples of where government does run effectively, and not perfectly, but effectively. And so, the system itself is not fundamentally broken. ACS is a great example. It's run by Jess Danhauser, who ran a nonprofit. His predecessor was David Hansel, who also was part of the nonprofit sector. Ron Richter was a previous administrator there. The people that they have hired and brought in over the years have experience on the nonprofit side. They understand the programs that they're running, and they care very deeply. And I'm not saying that's not true in other agencies. I'm just giving an example of and not to say that everything's perfect at ACS. If you have delayed payments there, right now I understand, but there is a way forward. They add money to budgets. They want to pay staff better. They understand the programs themselves. And so I also think it's important to, to Ira's point, there is a better way. And actually there's some examples in government of if you just hire really smart people who care about this deeply and you give them some power and autonomy, that a lot can move in between, these cycles.
Okay, another audience question. This one's throwing out a slightly innovative idea. Is there any opportunity to use funding from the city or state as a loan fund to sort of, with lower no interest payments rates, lower no interest rate, to sort of cover the late payments?
So the Fund for the City of New York does that.
Okay.
And so do we. the fund for the city of New York's great, but it's small. So it's simply not big enough. And then here's another little thing that you have to remember. Most of this country is common law, which basically means if it's not specifically prohibited, it's deemed allowed. Most city bureaucrats believe it's a civil law country, where if it's not specifically allowed, it's deemed prohibited. And so that applies to lending. Like the agencies don't have to use the fund. They can. And so there's lots of people who simply aren't referred to the fund. And sometimes people are referred and the fund doesn't have any money. And there's nothing that precludes, under city law, there's nothing that precludes the city doing the same deal with lenders like us that they do with the fund for the city of New York, but they simply don't do it. And so I think that there's, to whoever asked the question, there should be a lot of opportunity to expand lending as a Band-Aid for people who are waiting to get paid. But the existing fund isn't big enough, and the agencies aren't doing the things they need to do to make it easier for third parties to do the lending. And there's only so many lenders out there who are willing to take no interest. So you've also got that problem. But I think it's a solution that should be pursued, because while we're waiting for a better system, nonprofits need the money, and lending it to them at zero interest is the easiest way to get it to them.
Okay, another question. We don't have lots of government funding, but want and can grow, and our service is needed. Should we avoid public funding? Advice on how to proceed.
Don't do it. No. Run. Whenever I run into a nonprofit that's like, we have no government contracts, I'm like, Godspeed, go live your life. I think, well, there's a couple of things wrapped up in that. I would say first, if there is an RFP that fits your mission, I think there's a lot of times organizations feel the need to grow, and we are not, this is where my own opinion is, we are not the for-profit sector. We don't have to have a growth model. If you're serving your community effectively, if you're running programs and you're mission driven, you don't need to, be a $10 million organization that becomes a 15, 20, yes, there are opportunities for that, doesn't mean you shouldn't, but I think the growth model in nonprofits is not always something that, people should strive for. But if you see RFPs, if you see programs that fit your mission, that fit your model, you should definitely go after them. But you have to realize that just like with private dollars or fundraising, there's using philanthropy where every 3 years they're like, we can't fund you anymore because we only fund people for 3 years. We don't want you to be dependent. And you're like, what a terrible model. We haven't solved poverty in 3 years, so maybe we should fund them for longer. There are also downsides with government funding, and the downsides are you need your own startup money. Right. You need to be able to suffer through delays in payment. But once you secure a government contract, you will have that for 5 to 7 years or longer, and you will also build the infrastructure through Passport and through your contract manager to apply for other RFPs. So the answer is really dependent on your organization and what you're trying to achieve. So if your board is we should be bigger, do not go after government contracts. That's a terrible reason to go after government funding. But if you're we do after school, and there's going to be a new RFP around that, and we'd like to expand into Brooklyn, or we would like to just upgrade our service model, then absolutely, but you just need to realize that you have to float a year's worth of that contract. You will be subject to at least 2 audits a year, a program audit and a fiscal audit. You will be annoyed at Passport and paperwork, but with that comes a lot of opportunity for growth and access to other government opportunities. So it's a mixed bag. I think it's really dependent on your organization size and mission.
Yeah, I think any individual or agency or organization, company, always diversify your portfolio. Do not put all of your eggs in one basket. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Right. I think it's important to have both public funding and private funding. And everyone has their own nuances and colors and tastes in the ways that they give you funding, whether it's a private company, a philanthropy, a foundation, and you gotta just be a good sport when you're dating all these people all at once and courting them, because clearly it's transactional and it's limited amounts and limited time, and they all have their own rules and their desires. So more power to you.
Okay, so we are apparently The Office, Parks and Rec, and The Bachelor?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so one just quick audience question, then move to the final question is, one of the audience members asked, well, if there was all this public outrage after the recently, how can this public rage sort of be harnessed past the immediate, oh my God, we just have public outrage, and maybe like thinking ahead that, oh yeah, we had public outrage, let's do something before we have another set of public outrage, then forget about.
What, can you be more specific? What are you referring to?
The letter
public outrage
writing or
articles
the people
and
at
things
the
like that
at City
come
Hall?
Oh, yeah.
About corruption?
We'll know about like the late.
I mean, I think this,
Oh,
Late
okay.
payments, yeah.
I
There's a
think
lot of
this,
things that we've had outrage
this
on.
administration has been largely immune to any kind of outside pressure, which is concerning. Yeah, I think you've had past administrations that were the opposite, where they wanted to, make everybody happy before they launched, and now you've got an administration that you could put 10,000 people on the street and they just don't care. But I think, the bill that we're talking about now with putting the city on the hook for the interest payments, that got their attention. So, I think they're going to ignore us until they can't anymore. So, and I think, getting them on the hook for some of this money is the way to do it. And I think to Councilmember Wan's point, like, we're all sick of these task force. Like, it's very easy. Like, I hate that we're even talking about new ways to fund these loans. Like, we should not even need the loans in the first place. Just pay everybody on time and all this goes away. It's really not that hard. And with a $115 billion budget, we've got the money to do it. But I think we've sort of, unfortunately, been painted into a corner with this sort of false austerity footing in myriad ways. And this is one of those ways where we're just like, gee, wouldn't it be great if we just had an easier way to pay the interest on our loans? Like, no, we should just be getting paid on time. But the city is not broke. We've got all the money we need to do all this stuff. It's just that we need to get our priorities straight.
Okay. So final question, and Michelle, we're going to start with you and come down the panel, is what is that one takeaway you'd like everyone to leave this panel discussion with?
So as an advocate, I have to remain hopelessly optimistic, or I wouldn't be, I would have left this job a long time ago. And so I think my one takeaway is, like, especially I think this builds off what the council member just said, is, when we did the Just Pay rallies last year, or 2 years ago, we had 6,000 people at City Hall. It's the largest rally that anyone's had there in a really long time.
Amazing.
We had 50 executive directors who stayed outside in the rain a month later for Just Pay, and we didn't get shit in the budget. And then in March, we got $1 billion. So 6 months later, we saw the change that we needed. And so I think these are a lot what can feel like very intractable problems. And to the question about, like, how do we capitalize on the public outrage, is to stay the course, right? It's that you have to throw everything at it. Some things stick, some things don't. And for the nonprofits who feel hopeless, you do have power to start negotiating your contracts, to join coalitions, whether it's a small coalition on, after school and that funding, or if it's HSC, or it's Kafka, or it's, there's a bunch of different organizations that you can join to push on this fight. And there is power that we have executives who will not start work on a contract until it's registered. And not everyone can do that, but the ones who can should. You should learn who your commissioners are, and you should email them, and you should annoy them. There is power in the work that we do, and there's also power in us doing that work together. And so I think that's what I would leave people with, is that there are solutions to this problem, but a lot of it is political. And I think the nonprofit sector tries to stay out of what they consider like the political process, but the work that you do every day is political, and the fact that you aren't getting paid on time is also political. And so joining those coalitions, being part of those advocacy efforts, and realizing that we didn't get here in a day, so we're not going to get out of it in a day, is, I think, really important, and hopefully a little hopeful for people in the room.
Julie?
So we have an election coming up. Speaking of politics, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but June 24th, mark your calendar, set a reminder. Make sure you vote, because elections have consequences. In addition to that, I think, as you heard from everyone across this table, we have a very special administration where they do not bat an eye at you screaming outside, you being in the press. They are just immune to it. But it is clear that they care about their personal relationships, right? Yeah, because those are the ones getting the contracts. Not that that's how you're going to get your contract, but it has been clear to us when we were organizing on getting mocks, their pegs restored, that those personal phone calls with your personal relationships with the deputy mayors as well as the commissioners matter. So as much as you can, get FaceTime with them, build a relationship with them, and make those calls, write those emails, because in those personal relational conversations, that seems to have more weight than the public shaming that we're often used to doing to say you're doing the wrong thing. And do not be afraid. I know that it's extremely scary, and maybe it's a little bit of Stockholm syndrome or whatever it may be, but don't be afraid. When you are doing your work and you're not getting paid for it, or you are being threatened and not being able to do the very important work that you do that affects millions of New Yorkers who live in New York City, the most vulnerable ones especially, do not be afraid. Because we need to fight, and we have power in numbers, and we can't be afraid to speak out, because Councilmember Brannan and I could advocate for you all we want, but they say, we haven't even heard from them. What are you talking about? Those organizations are fine. I was just with them. She was smiling at me. Like, don't take
smile.
Smiling.
don't take her professionalism for granted, okay? So don't be afraid, and we're here to support you. So reach out. I very much enjoy those whistleblower conversations. I'm like, yes, tell me all the gossip. Let me know what's happening. So keep in touch, and hopefully we'll see more and more progress every single year.
John?
So I would remember, despite being sort of depressing, it wasn't that long ago that people brought documents in triplicate, sometimes in vans, because they were so voluminous. You know, we have improved some things with technology. We have the 25% advance that we didn't have. We have the 3-year discretionary items. We'll see if that matters. So there has been progress, number one. Number two, to the council member and to Michelle's point, do join HSC or UNH or Kafka or whoever it is to advocate in a small way. But while you're waiting for the problem to get solved, or if it's never solved, at least improved, do make sure you know what you're getting yourself into. I mean, I think taking a big contract on that is meaningful in terms of the size of your own organization is often the road to perdition, and just making sure that you understand with your board and your staff what it might take, and make sure you understand how long it might take to get paid, so that you can embrace that risk or not in full knowledge, because you don't want to risk your organization, your livelihood, and your staff because the city's not paying you on time, and sort of doing that analysis in a clear-headed way, I think is something that you can do while you're waiting for the council members and others to solve the problem. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I would say never lose sight of the work that you do is so important. So important that the city trusts you to do it, because they can't do it on their own and they can't do it without you. They might not act like it when payday comes, but clearly the work that you do is so important and crucial to the city and to our most vulnerable New Yorkers that we can't do it without you. And you do have folks like me and Councilmember Juan and others who care very much about these issues, who have been listening and doing whatever we can to turn that into action, to actually fix this thing. And getting you guys paid on time is the number one priority for me. And we're willing to, allow OMB to make the change on their own, but if not, we're going to pass legislation to do it, because enough is enough, and I'm tired of sounding like a broken record on this stuff. But we've got your back, I know you've got our back, and we're in this together. You might not help to hear it, but you're not alone, clearly, and we're doing everything we can to fix it, and it's a huge priority of mine and of this council.
See yourselves as organizers, mobilize your people, and be fearless.
Okay, so I just want to thank everyone and thank our panelists, and I think, to me, the takeaways that I've been discovering is leave the smiling to task force members for their group photo.
Stop, cut it out with the smiling.
Be I'm beginning to think Iris therapists may just be staging a lot of this as a way to keep him around. And 3, and Michelle, I'll join you in the optimism department, is maybe, hopefully, at next year's conference, we've taken, I don't want to say anything more than baby steps to moving in the right direction. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of the conference. You're welcome.